You know, while the whole world was watching the beaches of Normandy, another battle, one of just unbelievable brutality, was raging in the jungles of Southeast Asia. This was a campaign fought by what they called the Forgotten Army, and it would end up as the single greatest land disaster in Japanese history. This is the story of that battle, the one that completely turned the tide of the war in the East. So here's the central question, and it's a wild one. In 1944, the Imperial Japanese Army kicks off Operation Yugo. It was this incredibly audacious march on Delhi meant to invade India and just shatter the British Empire. So how on earth did this bold, almost arrogant gamble turn into their worst military catastrophe ever? Well, let's dig in. You can really boil this whole campaign down to a duel between two commanders who could not have been more different. On the Allied side, you have Lieutenant General William Slim. The man was a brilliant pragmatist, totally obsessed with logistics, supply lines, and the morale of his soldiers. Then, opposing him, you have Lieutenant General Renya Mutaguchi. He was a pure fanatic who genuinely believed that the spiritual power of a Japanese soldier could overcome, well, anything. Bullets, starvation, you name it. It's pragmatism versus fanaticism, and that clash is going to decide everything. Okay, so just to get our bearings, here's a quick look at the timeline. The whole thing really explodes into action in early 1944. There's a diversionary attack in February, then the main invasion kicks off in March. By April, you've got these two desperate sieges at Kohima and Imphal. The breaking point finally comes in late June, and by July, that once unstoppable Japanese army is in a catastrophic retreat. We're going to hit all these key moments. Right, let's set the stage. It's early 1944. The front in Burma is just a bloody, muddy stalemate. For Japan, though, India is the real prize. I mean, it's the jewel in the British crown, right? Taking it wouldn't just be a military win, it would be a massive, world-changing political statement. Mutaguchi's plan, Operation Yugo, had three incredibly ambitious goals. First, hit the Allies before they can launch their own big offensive into Burma. Second, cut the vital supply lines, the railway and the air corridor that were keeping nationalist China in the fight. And third, the ultimate prize, march onto Indian soil and spark a huge anti-colonial rebellion that would just tear the British Raj apart. But here's the thing, the plan was, frankly, borderline insane, and Mutaguchi's own commanders knew it. They were expected to march across this impassable jungle terrain with only 3 weeks of supplies, basically banking on capturing British food and ammo just to survive. One of his own generals, Kotoku Sato, was so horrified he wrote this absolutely scathing protest you see here. He was completely ignored. That one decision would seal the fate of tens of thousands of his men. So now, let's follow the northern pincer of the Japanese attack. It leads to this tiny hill station called Kohima, a place that was about to become the site of one of the most desperate and brutal sieges of the entire war. They call it the Stalingrad of the East for a reason. The fighting here got so intense, so unbelievably close, that it actually devolved into what we now call the Battle of the Tennis Court. No, I'm not kidding. Japanese and Allied soldiers were dug in on opposite sides of the Deputy Commissioner's tennis court, literally lobbing grenades at each other from just a few yards away. The white lines of the court became no man's land. It's completely surreal. And this slide just drives home the unbelievable odds. At the beginning of the siege, you had this tiny garrison of maybe 1,500 Allied troops, and that includes cooks, clerks, anyone who could hold a rifle, holding off an entire elite Japanese division of over 12,000 men. The odds were just staggering. Okay, so if Kohima was the hammer of the Japanese attack, the main prize, the anvil of the Allied defense, was the city of Imphal. And this is where the entire campaign was won and lost. It all came down to one thing: logistics. And this is where General Slim's genius really came into play with his new doctrine. See, the Japanese loved to sneak behind enemy lines and encircle units, counting on the panic to cause a retreat. Slim's order was simple. If you get surrounded, you do not run. You dig in, you form a defensive perimeter, an admin box, and you wait. We will supply you from the air. This one idea completely changed the psychology of the war for his soldiers. This chart shows you everything you need to know. The Allies flew in whatever they needed, a constant stream of supplies just falling from the sky. The Japanese, on the other hand, were relying on capturing enemy supplies and using pack animals. But then the monsoon rains hit. The jungle trails turned into rivers of mud, their animals died, and their whole logistical system just collapsed. The sheer scale of this Allied airlift, codenamed Operation Stamina, was mind-blowing. Just look at these numbers. They didn't just fly in bullets and food, they flew whole divisions of fresh troops into the siege. And, this is so crucial for morale, they flew the wounded out. A soldier now knew that if he got hit, he wasn't going to be left to die in the jumble. That's a game changer. It all came to a head in moments like the fight for Nungshikim Ridge. The Japanese captured this high ground that overlooked the main airfield, threatening to cut the garrison's only lifeline. In a desperate counterattack, Allied tanks literally clawed their way up these impossibly steep slopes to blast Japanese bunkers at point-blank range. It was an incredible, heroic moment that saved the entire siege. So this combination of a stubborn, dug-in defense and just overwhelming air power was too much. The Japanese offensive sputtered, it stalled, and then it collapsed completely. And what followed was one of the most horrific, nightmarish retreats of the entire Second World War. The big moment, the climax, came on June 22nd. Troops that were pushing south from Kohima finally met up with troops pushing north from Impal. The road was open, the siege was broken. And for the Japanese 15th Army, this was the beginning of the end. These numbers, they tell the real brutal story. The Allies took about 16,500 casualties, and most of those were from combat. The Japanese lost nearly 4 times that many, around 60,000 men. But look, just look at the primary cause of death. It wasn't Allied guns. It was starvation and disease. Mutaguchi's logistical fantasy didn't just lose him the battle, it destroyed his own army from within. But hold on, there is one final, absolutely fascinating twist to this whole story. Fighting alongside the Japanese was a force called the Indian National Army, the INA, and its legacy is, well, it's complicated. Militarily, on the battlefield, the INA wasn't very effective. They were poorly supplied by their Japanese allies, they didn't have heavy weapons, and they really couldn't go toe-to-toe with the professional British and Indian Army. They did manage one big symbolic victory, raising the Indian flag for the first time on what they called liberated soil, but their actual combat impact was pretty small. So where's the twist? Well, the INA's real impact came after the war was over. The British decided to put the captured INA officers on trial for treason, and it backfired spectacularly. The trials turned these men from traitors into national heroes, sparking riots, and proving to the British that they could no longer rely on the loyalty of their Indian troops. So in the ultimate irony, the March on Delhi failed, but its legacy helped push Britain out of India just 3 years later. The cost of this victory was just immense, and it's best remembered by this incredibly haunting epitaph. It's carved into the memorial at the Kohima War Cemetery, right where that tennis court once stood. It's a powerful, powerful reminder of the sacrifice made by those soldiers of the Forgotten Army. And that kind of leaves us with one last thing to think about. This was a battle that not only destroyed a Japanese army and turned the tide in Asia, but through the really strange legacy of the INA, it also helped speed up the end of the British Empire. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How often do the political aftershocks of a battle end up being way more important than the military result itself?